In this video, I'm going to talk about misconceptions teachers have about culturally relevant teaching. Oftentimes, we use different terms and we may be using them interchangeably, but they actually don't mean the same thing. So, to get us started in this class, in this module, it's best if we understand what exactly does culturally relevant teaching mean and then what does it look like in our classrooms. One thing, I use the word culturally relevant teaching or culturally responsive teaching interchangeably. Those two can be used interchangeably, but just you may see places where I say culturally responsive teaching or culturally relevant. So the first thing to keep in mind is that culturally relevant teaching, it's not simple. It is holistic and it should be so embedded into the teaching and learning in the classroom that it's not something an outsider could stand outside your window and say, "Oh, there it is. I can pinpoint right there the culturally relevant teaching." It's you think about for those of you in early childhood and even education in general, we talk so much about differentiation. And to be able to do that, you have to know your kids. And then that impacts every aspect of your classroom. The same thing should be considered when you're thinking about culturally relevant teaching. It's so ingrained that you don't see it right off the bat. So on the flip side, if I'm looking into, I'm looking through a window into a classroom and I see um, pictures on the wall that represent cultural diversity. That's great, but that's not culturally relevant teaching. So the terms that are used interchangeably, but they shouldn't, are multicultural education, social justice education, and then culturally responsive teaching. These overlap in certain ways, but they don't all mean the same thing. So let's take a look at what each one of these means. So multicultural education, this is the celebration of diversity. And so this is where you have the pictures on the wall. You have diverse dramatic play props. You have diversity in the block area. That's what you see when you look through that classroom window. This is beneficial, especially for social and emotional development, but it doesn't impact the child's learning capacity. Um, Thinking about culturally relevant teaching, this is focused on how do we strengthen the child's cognitive abilities or their learning. Having the pictures on the wall is great, but what does that do for their cognitive learning? Social justice education, this is equally as important, but again, it's not quite culturally relevant teaching. Social justice education is building a lens for students to look at the world and see things aren't fair or where injustices exist. So this is being very mindful of pointing out things that are not fair. Um, but again, it's not the same as culturally relevant teaching. You'll see in the books that we read, these different terms are used. So I encourage you to reflect on when they're saying, for example, social justice, what specifically are they talking about and how is that different than the overall culturally relevant teaching? So culturally responsive teaching, this is where you're building the learning capacity of the individual student or child. So this ties directly back into differentiation, really being in tune with what are the specific needs, learning styles, background, family dynamics, all of that for your individual students. I know in this class some of you are not in early childhood, and a cornerstone of early childhood education is going on the home visits. The family plays a huge piece, or should play a huge piece in the child's learning. So the same thing, that's how you get started with culturally responsive teaching. You also focus on leveraging the affective and the cognitive scaffolding the student brings with them. That's really tuning into what are their learning styles, what are their cultural beliefs about learning. So, for example, in a lot of well, a lot of diverse cultures. So Asian families, Latino families, African American families, there's much more a sense of community and the collective community, whereas the typical um, Eurocentric view is individualism, and so it's, keep your eyes on your paper, do your own work, mind your own business. Whereas a lot of the cultures that your children are coming from may have a more collective background. So really being in tune to what does each student bring and how does that impact their learning, and then you also want to capitalize on that. So that's where the leveraging piece comes into play. So, what are some benefits of culturally responsive teaching? As I just said, it builds on what the children already know and what they've experienced. So, this really ties into making sure you know that child's background and their family and anything that could impact how they learn. Um, Culturally relevant teaching helps students embrace their culture and themselves. It can foster a love of learning that's rooted in identity rather than simply subjects. It highlights students' unique strengths and encourages understanding of differences. It creates a diverse environment. It enacts different learning and teaching styles. It identifies the interactions of classmates' interests, passions, and experiences. It enables students to take control of their own learning in a supportive atmosphere, and encourages meaningful connections between teachers, children, and families. So as I'm reading that, coming from an early childhood background, I'm thinking, yes, yes, yes. If we're doing early childhood education right and in a meaningful way, we should be hitting all of these. However, that's not the case in a lot of classrooms. So as we move through this course, I want you to really think about how culturally responsive is your teaching, your school setting, whatever setting you work in, because I view it as a continuum, and no matter where you are, you can keep strengthening and building and getting better at being culturally responsive.